Last week, I interviewed Dr. Kristen van de Biezenbos, faculty of law at the University of Calgary, about why electricity rates in Alberta are so high. And we got talking about who owns what parts of the electricity system, the distribution and transmission, the wires, the power generation, the retail, and so on. And she talked about that ownership being tied sometimes to national interest, or more specifically, public interest. And I wanted to explore what public interest means today within our national and within the Alberta energy system. So welcome to the interview, Kristen.
Thank you very much, Markham.
Now, this will be a bit more free-flowing than our previous interview, and viewers can go on our YouTube channel and find that. But this one is more about, an idea, the idea of public interest. Because I remember, I'm kind of a child of the 60s and 70s when there were plenty of crown corporations around, and Canadian governments, both federal and provincial, owned parts of the economy because it was deemed to be in the public interest. And then after 1980s or so, our perception, our definition of public interest changed, and we privatized a lot of those bits. And now I'm hearing that public interest argument coming back. So maybe what's your take on how we should think about the idea of public interest?
It's interesting that you mentioned, it's definitely true that in the 80s, there was sort of this sense that switching publicly owned companies over to private industry would achieve efficiencies and lower costs. But that's only true when you have really robust competition. When you don't have robust competition, then you end up with a system where you have just a few companies that are not facing much competition. They can provide sometimes subpar services at prices that aren't particularly low. And so I think people are becoming more interested in the idea of looking at possibly moving some of those services back into the public sector, because there are some benefits that are associated with moving things to the private sector, but the conditions have to be right to realize those benefits. So we have not seen that across every sector that has been made public that was once private. In Alberta, we have a private industry-driven electricity sector, which makes it very different from the electricity sectors in other provinces like British Columbia that have crown corporations. Although Alberta actually never had a crown corporation, there was actually a plebiscite. There was a question of the people of Alberta were asked whether or not they would like to have their electricity delivered by a crown corporation, and very narrowly voted no, probably because the question was raised in around the same time that a lot of this sort of idea that you could achieve all of these great things if you turned over things that had previously been managed by the government or was publicly owned to private companies. So, but the idea of public interest, at least in the context of electricity, is that we pay rates, which means we cover the costs that are incurred by these companies, which of course in Alberta and Nova Scotia and a few other places means you're paying the costs of private companies. And the only way that you can really justify having the public pay costs incurred by private companies is if you can make the argument that it's in the public interest. They're delivering a public service.
Okay, so we're within the economic realm, if we're talking about public interest, it's the public is being asked to pay for a service. It could be telecommunications, because we saw the Rogers outage not that long ago, and there was a lot of talk about who should own the telecommunications backbone in Canada, whether that should be owned by the government or a public agency versus private. And then we're talking about the electricity system. So if we're paying for it as ratepayers, then if the public interest is to have it as dependable, as low cost and reliable and efficient as possible. And then we have to decide whether, if that's the public interest, the public interest is better served with private ownership or with government ownership. Have I got that correct?
That's right. Yes.
So how do we make some of these determinations around, like in the electricity system, in Alberta, it looks like the wires, the distribution and transmission are kind of, they're not owned by government, but then they're owned by private companies, but they're managed by the Alberta electricity system operator. But then power generation, a lot of that is private. All of it is private. Are there any public interest arguments there for having more government ownership or more public ownership than there is now?
I think so, particularly in the context of transmission and distribution. Transmission and distribution are what we call natural monopolies. So on the generation side, so Alberta used to have private companies that owned generation, transmission, and distribution. It's called a vertically integrated monopoly. So they own the entire system within a particular geographic area. Some of those utilities are still around, like Capital Power, Edmonton Power, or EPCOR. So in the 90s, Alberta ordered the electricity sector to be, they call it unbundling. So they broke up the electricity system into 4 sectors: generation, transmission, distribution, and retail. Part of the reason why they did this was to try to achieve competition in the generation and retail sides, to try to make the prices lower and to achieve those efficiencies. But with distribution and transmission, there was a sense that it doesn't actually make sense to introduce competition in those areas, because it doesn't actually achieve any efficiencies or lower costs to have multiple sets of transmission lines and multiple distribution systems trying to reach the same people. And so those companies are allowed to maintain their monopolies, but subject to what's called the regulatory compact. And the regulatory compact is basically saying you may keep your geographic monopoly, but in return, to ensure that everything that you are putting into your rates is in the public interest, and that it is encouraging low or just rates and reliable service, then we will allow you to keep your geographic monopoly, but in return, we will regulate your rates.
Okay, so if something's in the public interest, then one of the ways for government to influence that without actually owning it is then to regulate it.
Yes, that's right.
So what would be the difference between, like, why would we as a society think about government owning something instead of regulating it?
Well, the reason why I think in Alberta this question is coming up, there's a couple of reasons. One is particularly with respect to transmission, we have seen some cases, like most recently the case of ATCO trying to overcharge the people of Alberta in order to achieve a business benefit for them, for their own parent company and one of their sister subsidiary companies. So you see that the way that the rate formula is designed, it encourages transmission companies to add more infrastructure, to build more. And the Alberta Electric System Operator is, they do a needs analysis whenever a new transmission line is proposed. So there is some oversight. But the fact is, all of the information about whether or not costs are justified, whether they're reasonable, whether the lowest price have been achieved, all of that information is within the possession of the transmission company, and they're required to basically show their receipts when they come to their rate making hearing, and they're asking the Alberta Utilities Commission to allow for all these costs to go into their rate. And there's just, because all of that information belongs to them, and because there's only so much checking that the AUC has the ability to do, the capacity to do, but also the time to do, often these kinds of things can slip through the cracks. It's not clear whether the AUC would have caught ATCO's 30% overcharge attempt had it not been for a whistleblower inside ATCO's own accounting department. So we can see that there is this sort of incentive for transmission companies to overbuild, or at least overcharge us for what they are building. And so that raises the question of, since there's really only 2 transmission companies in the whole provinces, AltaLink and ATCO, are we actually getting anything out of this in terms of allowing them to maintain their monopolies? If we did also allow some government ownership of lines, we might have that additional oversight where the costs are being generated by the government or by a government contractor, so we can see exactly what the costs are right from the beginning. We're not sort of having to take their word for it, in a sense. So I think that there's at least an argument to be made that there's an argument to be made that it would be better serving the public interest to give more sort of provincial or government or federal government oversight over transmission costs. The other thing we need to think about is the fact that because we are trying to rapidly decarbonize in order to meet Paris Agreement goals, especially in provinces like Alberta, where we're having a really hard time transitioning away from fossil fuels, if we were to add the kind of wind and solar that we need to meet our decarbonization goals, we have to build a lot more transmission fairly quickly. And I think there's an argument to be made that it shouldn't be the private transmission companies that get to experience a financial windfall because of these climate change imperatives that are meeting a national goal. So I think there's at least an argument to be made where even if you don't want to phase out companies like ATCO and Altalink, you might want to have the government, whether it be provincial or federal, cover the costs of some of these new transmission lines, because if you don't, the costs will go into the rate and power bills will continue to climb in Alberta.
Right. And you brought up the issue of ATCO, which is kind of it's an operational issue. But then there's the expansion issue, which you also raised, and we're doing it in response to climate policy, but also because essentially electricity technologies have become more efficient and less and lower cost in many ways, like transportation, for example, electric vehicles versus internal combustion engine vehicles. So now we have to build out the electricity infrastructure to provide all of that power and get it to where it needs to go. But there are some strategic considerations here. And one of them is the fact that I think I've interviewed any number of economists who talk about how the wind and solar resources in Alberta and Saskatchewan would really benefit from using the hydropower in BC and Manitoba as like big batteries. So the whole system, lots of more east-west trade, and using that hydro storage as a way to increase the intermittent renewables in Alberta and Saskatchewan. That's really hard to do, to get the people talking about it. But if government owned it and had an incentive to build those interties, then that might be a huge advantage, an economic advantage for Alberta. And is that not a good public interest argument?
I think there's certainly, yes, there's an argument to be made, especially since by having government ownership and financing of those types of lines, the people of Alberta are not being asked to pay for what will be a huge economic boost to them. Because yes, that's right. We have enough wind and solar here in Alberta and Saskatchewan that if you had it's called an unconstrained grid. So if you had connections going from British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan to Manitoba, you can create a sort of self-sufficient on renewables using hydropower as that sort of storage avenue, but also providing firm power to Alberta and Saskatchewan. And they also can export their wind and solar power to meet additional needs in Manitoba and British Columbia. And it would really be something. There's enough wind and solar, I think, in Saskatchewan and Alberta that it would really be transformative in Western Canada to be able to connect all of that. But as you say, it would be extremely difficult to do. The way the economics are now, there's not a lot of incentive for the provinces to connect to each other.
And I guess as someone who's been reporting on these issues for a number of years, it seems to me that whether or not the public interest argument favors government ownership or favors private ownership and government, public regulation, how we ought to go. The important thing to begin all of this is to have the conversation.
Yes.
And we're not having the conversation. We're just pretending like, as if over the next 30 years, so somehow this, we're going to electrify things and it'll just magically happen. Somebody will look after it. We don't know who that is. We don't know how it should be done, but somebody will look after it. And they'll always, every time we flick the switch, the lights will come on. Whereas I think we really need to have both a provincial conversation in Alberta about how this is best to take place, and a regional conversation with between at least the four Western provinces. And then, of course, the conversation with the federal government. And Canadians at least need to be plugged into that, so they know what's going on and know what the issues are and whether or not their interest is being protected and being best served.
I think that's a really good point. And it's interesting because actually the federal government has what's called the convening power, where they could actually call a convention basically of the Western states to talk to each other and perhaps even engage in first ever regional planning. Regional planning is not something that we do for electricity in Canada. It's interesting because it happens a lot in the US and the EU, but the way that electricity utilities came about in Canada, it's always been highly provincial. I think that what we're seeing is a little bit of hesitancy by the federal government to get involved in electricity unless they come in with something good, a plan that they can pitch to the provinces that's clear and the economic benefits are there from the get-go. And it's a little bit tricky because the markets in the different provinces they're just very different from each other. Alberta has a competitive power market for generated electricity that doesn't actually, right now anyway, it hasn't been particularly cheap. And so trying to get BC Hydro interested in connecting and possibly buying wind and solar from the power market in Alberta is not attractive because the prices are so much higher than the rates are right now in BC. But if you think outside the box, there are actually models out there of different types of parallel power markets that can exist in tandem to these more provincial markets as well. So there are ways that we could go about doing it without disturbing the existing provincial power over their own existing grid. It just will take some creativity and some boldness really by the federal government to start thinking about how would you do this and how do you pitch it? And how do you show the provinces that it's worth their time and worth money?
Yeah, I think you're bringing up the regional planning in the US and the EU. I pay particular attention to the FERC in the US, and they already have regional planning models, and they're planning on doing a lot more of it, expanding the regional planning. And as a result of that, they're talking about building a lot more east-west transmission capacity. They're talking about more robust and more complex markets, a day ahead or 5 minutes ahead, those sorts of things that we just in Canada, it's just, it's like a foreign language in Canada. And it seems like if we kicked off this conversation about what's in the public interest, we might get into some of those conversations that the Americans have been grappling with for years on how to integrate intermittent renewables, how to make it more efficient, how to make it work better. They're at least having the conversation. We don't have an institutional framework to even begin having that conversation.
That's true. I mean, and I think the federal government, every system has its pros and cons. One of the things that having a crown corporation gives you in terms of a pro is having more direct control over rates. So the rates can be a lot lower than what you get in a competitive market. So the power rates in Alberta are significantly higher than they are in British Columbia and Saskatchewan and Manitoba. But there's just not this sense of, well, but does that have to be true if you start connecting to more resources, if you start getting more, because what that does is it puts more players in the game, and more competition can be a really, really good thing. And one thing that you almost never hear people talking about is real regional planning, which means not just interties, connecting one grid to another, so BC Hydro to Alberta's grid, but actually also having a truly unconstrained grid where you could have a major solar project in a place like Alberta that connects directly to the grid in British Columbia, for example, because they do a lot of that in the US too, where there's a sense of, well, there's a great need for more solar power in California. There's a lot of solar energy in Arizona. Let's make these two things connect with each other. That does not happen. The only example of that is Churchill Falls, which sends hydropower from Newfoundland to Quebec. And of course, if you know anything about that's not actually the most amicable example of that kind of a connection. So.
Right. But given the changes that are going to be required to double or triple the amount of power that we generate in order to power our electric cars and our heat pumps in our homes and electrify industry and so on, it took us 125 years or more to build the system that we've got. And now we're talking about doubling or tripling it. It seems like we have to think outside the box. And it may be that the public interest argument is the place to begin the conversation about thinking outside that box.
I agree. I mean, think about it a little bit like, to me, this is the sort of, it's going to be such a huge project. It's on the level of building multiple interprovincial highway systems almost. And we wouldn't feel weird about the federal government providing funding for that. But if we keep doing things the way we've been doing, then it's going to force the rates to go up considerably, at least in the short term. Ultimately adding all of those renewables will cause power bills to go down because the power that's generated from wind and solar is significantly cheaper than power generated by fossil fuels. So for Alberta and Saskatchewan, the gains are not just direct financial gains from building all of these projects and employing all the people to do it, but also seeing your bills come down significantly. But to get there, you have to spend a truly staggering amount of money. Building transmission, even more efficient new direct current transmission lines, is an extremely expensive proposition, certainly in the hundreds of billions, possibly even more than that. So I think we have to think outside the box or it's just not going to happen.
Well, Kristen, thank you very much. Interesting and intriguing comments and insights. And I think that maybe that we're right here is that the public interest is the springboard by which we get into that conversation about where Alberta's electricity system, how it needs to evolve. I guess that conversation really needed to be started, yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, sooner rather than later would be fine as long as we do start that conversation.
Well, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Markham.